Alright, let's see how this goes. Smoking! The Mask. So The Mask came out in 1994 and is loosely based on the Dark Horse Comics series of the same name. But where that comic was dark and disturbing, this movie is more lighthearted and goofy, you know, your typical Jim Carrey comedy. And this has to be my favorite of the golden age 90s Jim Carrey movies. You know, you got the Ace Ventura movies, Liar Liar, Dumb and Dumber, and The Mask. Those really are the cream of the crop when it comes to Jim Carrey comedies, and The Mask is right there among them and is my favorite. And that's probably because it takes two things that don't really seem like they go together and does it really well. It combines a grungy, comic booky, 1989 Batman-inspired crime story with a dude whose superpowers are derived from Looney Tunes cartoons, and that unlikely pairing gives us the perfect amalgamation of Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Batman 89. Two movies that do both have some film noir influence but are very different in tone and storytelling. But The Mask makes it work by giving us a superhero that you don't take too seriously, that is just having a lot of fun, and you're having fun in this world, but the world has legitimate threats. The gangsters in this movie don't feel like they're out of Saturday morning cartoons. They feel like they're the mob from Batman. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So this movie opens up in Edge City, and Edge City is kind of like Gotham City if they turned the lights on every once in a while and actually had sunlight during the day. Sure, it'd still be dirty and kind of disgusting and not a great place to live, but at least, you know, you won't have this big depression cloud hanging over the city all the time. And that's where we meet our main character, Stanley Ipkiss, played by Jim Carrey. And Stanley Ipkiss is this kind of typical nice guy, kind of down on his luck. He tries to do good, but nobody notices him, and he just gets stomped on. He doesn't really stand up for himself at all. And Jim Carrey's performance here as Stanley Ipkiss may be his best performance to date, or at least it's my favorite because it's subtle and it doesn't feel like he's acting when he's Stanley Ipkiss. Even in some of Jim Carrey's more subtle and grounded performances, like in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, it still feels like he's acting. It still feels like, oh, this is Jim Carrey trying to be a serious actor. In The Mask, I don't feel that because he's still Jim Carrey. He's still kind of quirky and kind of goofy and probably watches too many Looney Tunes, which is what I would assume the real life Jim Carrey is probably a lot like. And I just really appreciate that Jim Carrey didn't make Stanley Ipkiss boring. It would have been so easy to make him just this generic dude, you know, to contrast the wild and wacky Mask side of his personality. But he didn't do that. He played Stanley Ipkiss like himself, like this kind of normal guy, but eccentric and has certain things that trigger him and has his own issues and flaws. I don't know why The Mask of all things is getting this kind of performance out of Jim Carrey, but we have it now and it's pretty great. But anyway, Stanley Ipkiss is working at the bank and he's not really having a great day until Tina, played by Cameron Diaz, walks in. And before I talk about Tina the character, I have to mention something about Cameron Diaz. This is Cameron Diaz's first movie. She wasn't really in anything before this, and here she is the love interest to our main character, and she does a great job. She's got really good comedic timing. Her facial expressions, you know, her big reactions are great, they're funny. She somehow can fit in the gangster scenes, but also fit in the wacky mask-centered scenes, so you know, there's range there. And Tina in this movie is basically Jessica Rabbit if she was more proportional. She's a nightclub singer, she's a seductress, she works for the mob, so she's kind of shady. Her ex-boyfriend Dorian, played by Peter Green, has aspirations to take over the mob and be the big head honcho himself, and so he uses her to run reconnaissance because he's about to rob the bank that Stanley Ipkiss works in. So that's really why she's there. She didn't walk in the bank to just say hi to Stanley. She's there to actually get info on the bank and the security system and kind of what to expect. And I've already kind of mentioned how the gangsters in this movie and the gangsters themselves feel plucked right from Batman 89, but Peter Green as Dorian really sells it. You know right away that he's the bad guy, that he's the one to look out for, and the movie consistently builds up tension between Dorian and Stanley, even though they're not really enemies in the traditional sense. It's more that this Mask character, Stanley Ipkiss, are just annoying the heck out of him, and he just wants to kind of do his thing on the side, but the Mask is kind of inadvertently ruining his plans, and that's really funny. But through a series of unfortunate events, Stanley Ipkiss comes across this mask, you know, floating in the water, and he thinks it's a person, but no, it turns out it's just garbage kind of floating in the shape of a man, and the mask is what he thought was the head, and he kind of takes the mask and brings it home. And later that night, Jim Carrey puts the mask on, and this is where we get into special effects territory. Now, The Mask came out in 1994. CGI was still kind of a new thing. It was very experimental. And this movie went all in the CGI department. Because when Stanley puts on the mask, he becomes a cartoon. His body now operates on cartoon logic, which means really no logic at all. So he can turn to a tornado, he can stretch really far, his eyes pop out of his head. He can do all these things that a normal human can't do, and if you tried to do it practically, it would look horrifying. Can you imagine Jim Carrey's head turning into the wolf in this either stop motion or animatronic wolf head? Yeah, that would turn this into a horror movie real fast. But thankfully, they put the time in and made the CGI work in a way that, while it still feels like CGI, it doesn't feel 100% realistic. It still works because it's not supposed to be realistic. It's supposed to be cartoony. And the finished result is appropriately cartoony, but it's still incorporated well into the scene where it doesn't distract you. And I have to give big props for the costume and wardrobe department on the character of the Mask, because when he turns into the Mask, yeah, the green bald head is taken right from the comics. And the rest of the outfit is cartoony, yeah, but it's cartoony in the kind of way that like the Joker's clothes are cartoony, or like the bad half of Two-Face's wardrobe in the comics is cartoony. It's like if you took that half and extended it to both halves, and that's kind of the weird out there polka dot stripe combination that you get with the Mask, and it just looks really cool, and it reads comic book, cartoon, right off the bat. And then you have the classic yellow zoot suit and hat, and that's a reference to Cab Calloway, and he worked on many Betty Boop cartoons. So great job on that. But going back to the green face real quick, Jim Carrey is surprisingly expressive in all that makeup. I mean, you know, if you've seen The Grinch, you know that Jim Carrey can really act under a lot of makeup because his face is so stretchy. But I think The Mask was really the first proof of concept for that, because that's a pretty thick mask. There's a significant amount of makeup on, and even with the fake teeth, it still feels like it's extremely expressive, which is great because it's a cartoon face. You know, cartoon faces are supposed to be really stretchy and expressive, and I can't think of a better actor than Jim Carrey to pull that off. So anyway, that night Jim Carrey kind of goes about town and gets into a couple different scrapes. He meets this motorcycle gang in an alley, and he kind of makes fun of them and does balloon animals, and it's really funny. And actually that scene is taken right from the comics. The Mask goes out and he bumps into this gang and he kind of entertains them with balloon animals, but then one of them turns into a Tommy gun and he shoots at him. But the biggest difference is that in this version, Jim Carrey just shoots at them and they all kind of run away and hide in a dumpster, and you know, he misses, and it's just to intimidate him more than anything else. But in the original comic, he shoots at them and they're all dead. He just blows them away. They're eviscerated. There's holes in them and they're dead. And another difference is how he goes about attacking the owners of the auto shop that kind of messed up his car. In the movie, he's holding on to these big pipes, and then he does something. You don't really see what he does until the aftermath, and you see these giant pipes sticking out of where the sun don't shine. But in the original, he jams one down the dude's throat and kills him, and the other one was just a pincushion of wrenches and car parts and hung up like a piñata. It's really gruesome and disturbing, and this is why I think New Line Cinema wanted to make this movie, because New Line Cinema got started in the 80s with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. You know, Freddy Krueger, a guy who had kind of a wacky gimmick that wasn't bound by logic and reason and had a good sense of humor, but he went about killing teenagers in very out there and creative ways, and I can see parallels between Freddy Krueger and the big head killer from the Mask comics, and I wonder how much of this script was meant to be more serious and dark and gritty like the comic, and like the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, you know, brand synergy. But I think something changed once Jim Carrey got on board, because he was known for more light-hearted comedies and kind of dumb comedies, and really, who else are you going to get to play this character other than Jim Carrey? So maybe they had to lighten it up because of that, but I would still kind of like to see a more faithful adaptation of The Mask made in the future. You know, everything's getting a reboot nowadays. I don't know, that's something I'd just love to see myself. But let me know in the comments if that's something that you'd like to see too. I'm curious. But the next morning, we're introduced to the straight man to Jim Carrey's comic, and that's Detective Calloway. And he's played by Peter Riegert. I hope I pronounced that right. And he's great. He's hilarious, because he is not putting up with any of Jim Carrey's shenanigans. He's just perfectly straight and to the point, and you know, all serious, you know, tough cop. And Jim Carrey's just giving him the run around this entire movie in typical Jim Carrey goofy style. That just frustrates him even more and gets him more determined to actually catch the mask. And it's really funny just how quickly Calloway figures out that Jim Carrey's the mask, because Stanley Ipkiss is not good at keeping a secret identity. He's never been a superhero before, and this is all new to him, so obviously he's not going to be that good at it. And Calloway sees right through the lies immediately, but he's kind of biding his time. He wants to get all the evidence to stack against him so that he can finally just lock this whack job up. But weirdly enough, nobody else actually figures it out until it's spelled out to them, which I guess makes sense because Stanley is such a nobody loser that nobody even pays attention to him anyway. So if he was acting weird or suspicious or strange, still nobody would actually care. And I can't talk about Calloway without talking about his partner Doyle. And again, these two are just a great comedic duo. You know, you got the straight man and the comic, and Doyle is great. He's your classic dumb cop stereotype, but he has a charm about him that I really like, and he may be my favorite character in the movie, because even though he's kind of dumb and goofy and isn't great in social circles, he still is mostly competent. For instance, he's the guy that actually successfully runs the fingerprints and gets a match on Ipkiss so that Calloway can then go arrest him. So yeah, point for Doyle there. But I realized watching this movie again that Doyle actually isn't in the movie that much. A lot of the scenes with Calloway is between Calloway and Jim Carrey, because you really just want your duo. A trio is kind of hard to write for, but I think it just shows how much of an impression that Doyle leaves on you as you watch it, that you don't actually realize he's not in the movie that much because he's just so hilarious and memorable. But going back to night 2, the second time Jim Carrey puts on the mask, he has the classic yellow suit and he goes to the club. He goes up on stage and dances with Tina in all cartoony fashion. And this is a good time to talk about the soundtrack in this movie. The soundtrack has a lot of R&B in it, which makes sense because it takes place in the inner city, so you want kind of an urban feel. But it also incorporates a lot of swing, and nowhere else in this movie does it do it better than in this dance scene. Because, I don't know, the song that plays there is just so catchy and great, and I want the soundtrack. It's a great homage to the old Cab Calloway, Betty Boop cartoons, and Cab Calloway's whole style and legacy. And watching it, I was thinking this song is only missing some Heidi Heidi Hoes, and it would be perfect. But it turns out in the third act, when they're going to this fundraiser event, they have a remixed version of Minnie the Moocher, I think. I mean, I hear the Heidi Heidi Hoes in that, and it's awesome. So yeah, it turns out this movie's soundtrack is perfect. But the fun and games don't last too long because Stanley has to meet Tina at Landfill Park as both himself and the mask. And he turns into the mask and he becomes French because he's just really turned on. And you know those French people like Pepe Le Pew, they just can't keep it in their tails. This is of course where Calloway and Doyle actually try to arrest Stanley. They're going through his pockets. The pockets are endless. They got all this space and they're just pulling out these random stuff. It is full on Roger Rabbit cartoon logic and I love it. But that's nothing compared to the Cuban Pete song, and I don't really know what I can say about that hasn't been said already. It's just great. It's hilarious. The acting is on point. The special effects are great. The sound effects are great. And Jim Carrey 100% commits to this dance routine and this character in that moment. It's really the one scene where I don't see Jim Carrey at all. I just see the mask because it's so animated and out there and over the top. But even though Stanley escapes, he still gets betrayed by Peggy Brandt. And I haven't really talked about Peggy Brandt yet because she's not really a major character. She's just there to offer contrast to Tina. You know, Tina's supposed to be this Jessica Rabbit stereotype, materialistic girl that'll, you know, betray you and is only in it for the money and the fame. And Peggy is the opposite of that. You know, she's more down to earth. She's not famous. She just kind of works in this newspaper, but she's got a very small byline. She's not that well published yet. But the reality is the exact opposite. Peggy ultimately is only in it for the money, and she rats Stanley out to the mob because there's this big price on his head. And Tina isn't actually in it for the money and everything, and she appreciates that Stanley didn't just treat her like a piece of meat, even though he kind of does throughout the movie. So that message kind of falls flat a bit. But the idea is an interesting one, that these two women turn out to be the opposite of what you would appear to be based on, you know, first impression. So Peggy betrays him and Dorian gets the mask. And when Dorian puts on the mask, it is hilarious and terrifying at the same time. I mean, it's a really cool design, although his face is not nearly as expressive and animated as Jim Carrey's was. So that's a little disappointing that you don't see as much variety in the face. You just kind of got this really extreme expression the whole time. But I guess it works for story reasons because, you know, the mask amplifies whatever's kind of buried deep inside. And Dorian is just a full-on evil, power-hungry monster on the inside. So when that's brought out, I guess that works. Honestly, the most interesting thing about that design is the kind of snake tongue when he tries to kiss Tina. That's pretty cool, but the rest of it's kind of just generic villain face. But I just don't love it as much as some of the other designs. For instance, in this climax when Jim Carrey goes to save the day and get the mask back and stop Dorian from blowing up the Coco Bongo and Tina and everybody else in it, Dorian takes off the mask and then loses it, and Milo finds it, you know, the dog. And when Milo puts on the mask, it is the coolest design in the movie that has been ruined by Son of the Mask. Son of the Mask just totally took that design and killed it. But I will say the design itself is still pretty cool. Milo's got this big monstrous dog head with sharp teeth, got the spike collar and everything. It's a great design. And the head is CGI, but the head is weirdly incorporated well into the rest of the dog body. Maybe it's because of the hard cutoff with the collar that's easy to kind of match the two layers, but that's pretty cool. And the climax is keeping in the spirit of the original comic, where Stanley Ipkiss was only the mask for a little bit and then he dies, and then the rest of the series is just the mask getting passed from person to person. And in a very condensed sense, you kind of get that here. You get Dorian with the mask, you get Milo with the mask, and then at the end you get Jim Carrey with the mask again, and he's, you know, the classic, I can't call him the big head killer because I don't think he actually killed anyone in this movie. But he does kill Dorian in the most cartoonish way possible. Dorian's coming at him with a knife and he paints a flush handle on the tree and he flushes this pond down a drain, and Dorian goes down the drain and the knife goes up and it comes down, and you assume that he died. And if that's not Looney Tune logic, I don't know what it is. But I guess now since he did kill Dorian, you can call him the big head killer. So that's what I'm going to do, but I don't really have any reason to because that's the last time he puts on the mask, and that's basically the end of the movie. And that's The Mask. I love this movie. I watched this VHS tape so many times as a kid. It's a miracle that it still worked. And if I'm being honest, when I was growing up, we didn't have that many DVDs to watch or VHS tapes. We had quite a few Disney VHS tapes, but other than that, we had a pretty limited selection. So if I wanted to watch a movie when I was little, we kind of just watched what we had, and The Mask was always one that I'd be like, yeah, let's watch The Mask again. Because as a kid, I loved the comedy. I loved the kind of cartoony style of The Mask's powers. It wasn't until I was much older when I really appreciated what this movie was and how it took so much influence from Batman and Nightmare on Elm Street and Who Framed Roger Rabbit to create this very unique experience. And as a kid, I didn't know that it was based on anything, and I thought it was so weird that The Mask was just this anomaly. It was this really cool idea, and growing up I would always say, like, somebody should make a comic book about The Mask, and it turns out, oh, there is a comic book. But now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about The Mask? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And be sure to share this video around because that's how the YouTube algorithm works now, and I could use the visibility. But as always, I'm Colby, this is My Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.